Slavery, the practice of treating human beings as property, stripping them of rights, identity, and freedom, has appeared in many civilizations throughout history. But one system stands apart because of its enormous scale, global reach, and lasting impact: the Atlantic slave trade. Between the early 1500s and the late 1800s, an estimated 10 to 12 million African men, women, and children were forced across the Atlantic Ocean. Millions more died before ever reaching the ships. Historians estimate that roughly 15% perished during the voyage alone. The numbers are staggering, but behind every statistic was a life, a family, a culture. Most captives came from regions in West and West Central Africa, including Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and the Congo-Angola region. These were not empty lands. They were thriving societies filled with farmers, merchants, soldiers, artists, spiritual leaders, and children growing up with dreams for their future. Yet over centuries, millions were forced into what became known as the Middle Passage, one of the most brutal migration systems in recorded history. The demand for labor in the New World. When European powers such as Portugal and Spain began establishing colonies in the Americas during the 15th and 16th centuries, they needed massive labor forces for plantations growing sugar, tobacco, and later, cotton. At first, indigenous populations were forced into labor, but disease, warfare, and exploitation devastated these communities, leading to severe labor shortages in European colonies. Plantation owners sought another source of workers. Their answer? Africa. Portuguese traders were among the first Europeans to establish direct slave trading routes along the African coast. Over time, Spain, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, and eventually colonial America became deeply involved in the system. In 1518, King Charles V of Spain authorized the direct shipment of enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. That decision accelerated what would become one of the largest forced migrations in human history. The triangular trade. The Atlantic slave trade operated within a larger economic system often called the triangular trade. It worked like this. European ships sailed to Africa carrying goods such as firearms, textiles, alcohol, and manufactured products. In Africa, these goods were exchanged for captives. The captives were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, the infamous Middle Passage. Ships then returned to Europe carrying plantation goods such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton. Europe supplied capital and manufactured goods. Africa supplied forced labor. The Americas supplied raw materials. This cycle generated enormous wealth for European empires and colonial elites, while devastating African societies. The Middle Passage, a floating prison. The Middle Passage was the ocean crossing from Africa to the Americas. It could take anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months, depending on weather and conditions. Below deck, human beings were packed tightly together in spaces sometimes no wider than a coffin. Historical records show that adult men were often allotted a space barely 6 feet long and little more than a foot wide. Women and children were given even less. Captives were chained at the wrists and ankles. Ventilation was poor. Disease spread rapidly. Food and water were rationed. Many suffered from dehydration, malnutrition, and infections. Mortality rates varied, but historians estimate that between 15 and 25% died during the journey. Crew members also faced high death rates due to disease, with some voyages losing nearly 1/5 of sailors. The conditions were so severe that the air below deck was described as suffocating. Survivors later recounted the overwhelming stench and the psychological terror of confinement. And yet, resistance still occurred. Resistance at sea, the Amistad revolt. In 1839, a group of Africans who had been illegally captured and sold in Cuba were placed aboard a Spanish ship named La Amistad. Led by Sengbe P, known in the United States as Joseph Cinque, 53 captives managed to free themselves from their chains. They killed the ship's captain and cook, but spared the navigator, demanding that he sail them back to Africa. Instead, the navigator secretly steered northward. 2 months later, the ship was intercepted off the coast of Long Island, New York. What followed was a landmark legal battle. Spain demanded the Africans be returned. The US government initially supported that position. However, abolitionists rallied public support. Former US President John Quincy Adams argued the case before the Supreme Court. In 1841, the court ruled that the Africans had been illegally kidnapped and had the right to resist captivity. The surviving 35 individuals eventually returned to Sierra Leone in 1842. The case became a powerful symbol within the American abolition movement. Where did most enslaved Africans go? Contrary to common belief, only a small percentage were sent directly to what would become the United States, roughly 4 to 6%. Nearly half were transported to Brazil. Large numbers were sent to the Caribbean. Others were dispersed throughout Spanish and French colonies. By 1820, almost 4 Africans had crossed the Atlantic for every 1 European. The labor of enslaved Africans fueled sugar plantations in the Caribbean, coffee production in Brazil, and cotton fields in the American South, industries that shaped global capitalism. African involvement in the trade. The Atlantic slave trade wasn't a simple story of one continent versus another. African rulers, merchants, and intermediaries were also involved. Some African states captured prisoners during wars and sold them to European traders. In certain regions, criminal punishment shifted towards enslavement because of the demand from European markets. In places like the Kingdom of Dahomey and the Ashanti Empire, slave trading became integrated into political and economic systems. On the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, alliances were sometimes formed between European traders and African elites through political agreements and marriages. However, opposition also existed. King Alfonso I of Congo wrote letters to the King of Portugal in the early 1500s pleading for an end to the trade, describing how kidnappings were depopulating his kingdom. African societies were not unified in their response. Some resisted, some participated, many suffered. The broader slave trades. While the Atlantic trade is often most discussed, it wasn't the only slave system operating at the time. Between the 7th and 19th centuries, trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trades transported millions of Africans to North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, and South Asia. Combined, these systems reshaped populations across continents. Was it genocide? Scholars debate whether the Atlantic slave trade qualifies as genocide. Historian Adam Jones has described the scale of death and destruction as genocidal in effect. Others, like Saidiya Hartman, argue that while extermination was not the primary goal, the system treated human lives as expendable, reducing human beings to commodities in a profit-driven machine. Whether defined as genocide or as a brutal economic system, the result was catastrophic. Millions dead, societies destabilized, and generations traumatized. Apologies and memory. In 1998, UNESCO designated August 23rd as the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. In 2001, at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, African nations called for formal apologies and discussions of reparations from former slave-trading countries. Some nations expressed regret, while others resisted formal legal responsibility. Today, memorials and museums across the world attempt to preserve the memory of those who suffered, including the United Nations' ongoing efforts to maintain a permanent slavery memorial. A legacy that still shapes the world. The Atlantic slave trade didn't just move people, it reshaped economies, built empires, fueled industrialization, and created racial hierarchies whose consequences are still visible today. Modern nations were built with wealth generated by forced labor. Entire regions of Africa were destabilized. Diasporic cultures emerged in the Americas, blending African traditions with new influences. This history is not distant. It lives in languages, music, food, faith, and political systems. Understanding it is not about assigning blame to individuals living today. It's about recognizing how deeply interconnected our global story truly is. Because behind